Buenas, le habla Manuel Frau Ramos, editor del Sol Latino. Estamos en el programa El Sol Latino Podcast 413, episodio número 43. Hoy 17 de febrero del 2021, transmitiendo directamente desde el oeste de Massachusetts en el Pioneer Valley. Como siempre, doy una introducción antes de darle paso a los invitados. Para las próximas ediciones del podcast tenemos básicamente, nos vamos con política. El primero va a ser Harry Frankie Rivera, que tiene dos artículos sumamente interesantes en el Latino River Radio de Julio Ricardo Varela sobre el estatus de Puerto Rico. Y él, como historiador, tiene una perspectiva muy única de la situación colonial de Puerto Rico. Posteriormente a él tenemos a Aldo Lauria Santiago, que nos va a hablar sobre la crisis del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños, que no es nada nuevo, pero esta es la nueva versión de este siglo del Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños. Y en febrero tenemos a Margaret Randall y Mariana McDonald, que acaban de sacar un libro que se llama Dominga rescata la bandera, sobre la masacre de Ponce. Dominga fue una de las líderes del Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño. La entrevistan. Para los que no sepan, Mariana McDonald en un tiempo, muchos años atrás, se llamaba Mariana Feliciano, viuda de Ramoncito Feliciano del área de Boston, un líder comunitario y veterano de Boston, y ahora vive en Atlanta bajo Mariana McDonald. Pues le damos la bienvenida. Bueno, antes necesito aclarar algo para aquella gente que no sepa historia de Puerto Rico. Cuando hablamos del Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, en esta ocasión nos referimos al movimiento pro independencia, que una vez fue uno de los movimientos sociales más importantes de Puerto Rico. En el pasado hubo otro Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño asociado a Santiago Iglesias Pantín. No estamos hablando estamos hablando de la nueva versión del movimiento pro independencia, Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, y muchas veces lo llamamos PSP. Por lo tanto, si oyen el PSP, muchas veces saben que es el Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño. Bueno, pues entrevistamos hoy a José Velázquez y Carmen Rivera, que junto con Andrés Torres son los editores del nuevo libro titulado Revolution Around the Corner, Voices from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party in the United States. Bienvenidos, José y Carmen. Y voy a empezar con algo muy interesante porque me gusta el título, Revolution Around the Corner, porque en Puerto Rico, tanto el movimiento pro estadidad como el de independencia siempre han utilizado una frase: la estadidad ya viene, la estadidad viene este cuatrenio, la estadidad viene pronto. El movimiento pro-independentista, desde que yo estaba en la escuela superior, nos decían: la independencia ya está a punto de ser lograda, la independencia viene, la independencia está. Y esa frase la hemos usado históricamente para ambos movimientos y todavía no llega a ninguna de las dos. Bueno, pues empezamos. José, Carmen, ¿quién quiere empezar explicándolo por qué ese título? Pues,
bueno, yo voy a empezar brevemente sobre ese título y José puede añadir definitivamente. Escogimos ese título porque en casi todos los capítulos que se escribieron en el libro, las personas se refieren a que creíamos que la revolución estaba a la esquina de la vuelta. Y entonces, pues, tratando de ver, bueno, ¿qué sería lo mejor para un título? Los tres editores, pues, empezamos a hablar y dijimos, Bueno, revolution around the corner is the phrase that everyone uses.
Mm-hmm.
It's what we thought was going to happen. It didn't happen. It has not happened, but it captures the sentiment of those who wanted to be part of that revolution and who wanted to organize around that. That was really the essence of it. And it was, it kind of came to us, you know, I remember my own son told me, Mom, the best way to find a title for a book is to read what everybody keeps saying over and over again in their stories. And that was very true.
Y Manuel, hay que decir y aclarar que fue Vivian Rivera la que por fin le puso el dedo a ese título tan importante, porque llevábamos años tirando para atrás y para adelante diferentes títulos, y un día Vivian dice, ven acá, pero todo el mundo habla de eso, de que el PSP parte era que se creía que la revolución estaba a la vuelta de la esquina. And that should be the perfect title. Y fue Vivian, y cuando ella lo dijo, we all said, wow. Not only is that a great summary, mm-hmm. but it's also, in terms of marketing, very, very catchy. Porque no solamente los independentistas, sino la izquierda norteamericana. Mm-hmm. You know, también everybody was a revolution around the corner.
Déjame añadir algo. Unos años atrás entrevistamos a Oscar López cuando vino de visita a Holyoke. Y esa pregunta yo se la hice. Y él pensó que en un momento la revolución y la independencia venía pronto. Desde el punto de vista de su grupo. De que eso ya era eminente por lo que estaba pasando en Latinoamérica, lo que estaba pasando en los Estados Unidos, en Europa, en África, Vietnam. Y por lo tanto coincidimos de que Revolution Around the Corner, o esa frase o una similar, era básicamente el vocabulario que se usó por décadas, tanto en el movimiento independentista como en el movimiento por estadidad por otra razón. Ok, yo me imagino que es difícil recolectar la información del movimiento pro independencia / Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, porque no hay un centro donde toda la información llegara. Sabemos lo que pasó con el periódico Claridad, se quema, se pierde parte de la historia, pero no hay... La historia está en individuos regado por todo el mundo. ¿Cómo ustedes bregaron con esa situación de tratar de crear o documentar una historia dispersa alrededor de todos los Estados Unidos? Carmen o José.
Sí, I'll start there. More than 10 years ago, a group of us got together and formed something that we call Despierta Boricua Recovering History Project, of which that T-shirt that you have in the back there, Protesta, was something that we used to fundraise for that. We wanted there to be a kind of a multimedia approach to telling the story of the MPI PSP in the United States. So that was the main thing. It was how do we tell that story? And so as we went on, we realized that we can't tell a story if we don't have documentation to back it up. And as you said, Manuel, it's true. There is no archival, complete, comprehensive archival collection on that work. And so what we began was an outreach, an extensive outreach to members, former members, asking them to give us give us their information, give us their archives, give us their materials. And so we did that for over a number of years. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies actually helped, and so I'll make this brief. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies gave us the first archival boxes. They gave us around 25 archival boxes and files. And then I started going around to different places and collecting people's material, to the extent that we now have what we consider to be a fairly complete archive of the works of the MPI and the PSP in Puerto Rico and the United States. And so it was because of that, because of our, it's painstaking work. It's not easy work. You have to sit there, you have to go through these papers, you have to file them, you have to create boxes where it's, clear what you're putting into them. I'm not an archivist. I call myself a paraprofessional archivist, but I became one with this project, and it was actually fun, and I was lucky that I had the time to do it. So we have now a complete, what we think is a fairly complete, not totally, but a good comprehensive archive of our work of Puerto Rico and of the United States.
Just so people understand, an archival box is not just the kind of box you can buy at the store.
No.
This is a special, can you explain that, please?
Yes. So actually behind me, I have kind of hidden, which I will unfold a bit. If you can see there, those are archival boxes. And we have, over 60 of those.
And one of the important things about these boxes is that they're made to withstand time. Everything you put in there is protected.
Exactly. These are the boxes that will preserve, will not allow for the collection to be in any way ruined or compromised.
Right.
And
so photos don't fade.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. So photos don't fade.
Exactly. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question for Jose, and then you. Given the climate that we have now in this country and in Puerto Rico, but then Puerto Rico is different in the sense of there's that financial junta there that basically is in charge of everything in Puerto Rico. How can a ideology grow? And this is talk about, okay, in Puerto Rico, how can el PCP grow and become something that people are talking about as much as they talk about the usual parties that have been in power since the 1950s, the Commonwealth Party and the Pro-Statehood Party. Jose, can you address that first, and then Carmen?
Well, do you mean how it grew historically?
No, I mean now. Now in this era.
Right. Well, very, very interesting. The movement that was represented by the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, which dissolved in the 1995, continued after the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, and the Puerto Rican Socialist Party was part of a broader independence movement, but also a movement tied to the labor. The difference with the PSP was that the PSP said not only was the issue of independence important, but social change, class was also important, and the working class would have to be the leader of that movement. Now, of course, whenever an organization dissolves, and in the way it dissolved, there's a vacuum, usually a vacuum, of many years, not only because of the repression, but also the political mistakes that were made by the organization. But let's take the last election, which I think is a a good measure of how sometimes many years later, the effects of what the seeds that you planted come out. For example, in this election, there were two candidates who both supported independence for Puerto Rico. The traditional Puerto Rican Independence Party and Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, whose candidate also supported independence for Puerto Rico. And between those two candidates got close to 30% of the vote. So what happened in the last election, it shows that Puerto Rico is divided into three parts, into a statehood party, which wins the election with only 32% of the vote. It actually is the minority party. But, you know, elections in Puerto Rico are not based on majorities, but plurality of the votes. El Partido Popular, the other traditional party, which stands for some form of, free association or the traditional Commonwealth government, got another 30-some% of the vote. And the independence candidates got another third of the vote. So they, in the last 10 years, there's been a rise, especially among young people, with the, again, sentiment that's either pro-independence or anti-statehood, if we may say, because the statehood party only got 32% of the vote. Now, of course, there was a plebiscite. I don't want to get into all the details. There was a plebiscite that was not supported by the Trump administration, but it was a plebiscite that said statehood, yes or no. And it only got 52% of the vote. Yes, 48% said no. It showed that the country is not in great majority in favor of statehood. And let me just also point out that people who are not Puerto Rican can also vote in that plebiscite because it's open to all citizens of Puerto Rico. There are tens of thousands of non-Puerto Ricans that live in Puerto Rico. Many of them favor statehood.
And to that point, Vivian, and we all know this, there's the pro-statehood movement in Puerto Rico, traditionally until recently, as you mentioned, Jose, would take close to half of the votes. And it went down by a lot, thanks to, as you pointed out, the rise of other movements. But here in the United States, so many Puerto Ricans have a completely different vision for Puerto Rico. So even the question for you is, why do you think that is, that Puerto Ricans in the United States, I don't call it the mainland. I think Puerto Rico is the mainland, and this is the United States. Why is that difference in perspectives regarding Puerto Rico, that so many Puerto Ricans here want independence for Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico, there's a strong statehood movement?
I think one quick answer to that, which we would allude to even when we were in the PSP, is the fact that we're living statehood. We are the example of what statehood means for ethnic national groupings that do not form part of what the United States considers the power majority. And so having faced discrimination, having faced all kinds of exploitation, beginning with those very early Puerto Ricans who came, all right, from 20s on. And as interestingly enough, as many of the new immigrants are facing now, right? Exploitation in jobs, exploitation in housing, discrimination in terms of education opportunities. So we have lived that quote second-class citizenship category. that is true, unfortunately, and in what we see in terms of, you know, the poverty rates for Puerto Ricans in the United States, the poor lack in terms of attaining better education and going on to higher education, in terms of our representation as far as whether it be in government or in other political structures or citizenship structures that would help our communities. You know, we're not sitting on the boards, you know, the community school boards in large numbers in cities where we are a dominant constituency. And so that, I think, is a part of it. We also, because we've also, in many ways, those young people now, and even us when we were young then, allied ourselves with the Black community because we lived together. We were side by side. And so we faced and we saw what we were denied. I think that's, you know, that would be my assessment of why it is then that, you know, Puerto Ricans here in the United States, particularly, you know, younger generations as we've moved on. You know, we have here already like 5-6 generation of Puerto Ricans, you know, living here. Young people who are influenced in so many ways, culturally, you know, and beyond, hip hop culture, you know, all of that. So, yeah.
Let's go back to the MPI PCP. As you know, when the young Lord decided to enter to Puerto Rico, basically not everybody received them with the open hands. No, there's something. I was in high school when they came to our high school, Escuela Superior Papa Juan 23. Everybody was, who is this guy? No, con afro. When the MPI entered to the New York, Chicago, Philadelphia era, came with the Spanish issue. Si tú no hablas español, tú no eres puertorriqueño. How played that situation with the Puerto Rican and the English-speaking Puerto Ricans?
Eso es importante porque Manuel, lo que tú te refieres es la ofensiva rompecadena, le decía a los Young Lords.
Okay.
Los Young Lords cuando comenzaron tenían la teoría de divided nation, that we were a divided nation. Y también tenían la idea de que el movimiento independentista en Puerto Rico era unos pequeños burgueses y no estaban haciendo el trabajo que había que hacer. Y los Young Lords iban a organizar en Puerto Rico. Cuando ellos llegan a Puerto Rico, llegan primero con un antagonismo contra el movimiento independentista que existía, además de lo que tú dices, la cuestión cultural, ¿no? I was part of that generation. Vivian, others, we're part of that generation. You know, the New York Rican generation that has had a big impact on Puerto Rican culture in other areas. But in terms of the political culture, this was something foreign. You know, having Puerto Ricans from the US gonna go to Puerto Rico and tell them how to run the movement. Now, vice versa, here you had an organization, the PSP, that is from Puerto Rico, MPI, PSP, that comes to organize in the United States. But the MPI was organized in the US almost as soon as it was organized in Puerto Rico in 1959. So it wasn't something that didn't exist. It was an integral part. And also Natalia brought up that there was a large independentista exile community that left Puerto Rico in the 50s. Porque si tú eras independentista, tú no podías conseguir trabajo. ni nada de eso, estaba carpeteado. So people who came to Chicago, to New York, to Philadelphia, to Massachusetts, there were pockets of independentistas, exiles, all the way back to the 1890s. So it wasn't something foreign. And then many of the Puerto Rican leadership, as Vivian pointed out, of the community organizations that began to develop were tied to the anti-war movement, to the civil rights movement, and independence, national liberation was only, one step. Everybody understood that. So that's why all the research showed that Puerto Ricans in the US had a higher support for independence during the 60s and 70s and 80s than in Puerto Rico, which Natalia brought out was so ironic. Even though I think we need to point out that some of that has changed a little bit, we are now seeing pockets of Puerto Rican leadership supporting statehood. Mistakenly, some of them think that it's a civil rights issue, at the statehood. And some of the Black leadership has also espoused support for statehood under civil rights leadership. But I would think that, as Natalia is right, that there's strong sentiment among Puerto Ricans in the US, as Vivian pointed out, for independence and against statehood. But it's hard to measure, but just like in Puerto Rico, it's a battle to convince people that not only is independence necessary, but that it's possible. It's like, que es posible.
There's also, when we talk about liberation, and this was a question I also posed to Oscar when he was in our region a couple of years ago. There's a lot of talk of liberation, but I never hear women's liberation. Puerto Rico, our culture is very violent towards women. And so, when we talk about liberation liberación para Puerto Rico, que Puerto Rico sea libre. And a lot of people can, sí, definitivamente, estoy contigo, pero no se habla de la mujer. Y esta pregunta, entonces, para ambos de nuevo, empezando contigo, José, when we talk about liberation, it just can't be of a country. It has to be of its people. And it has to be of all the communities within that population. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I think the female leaders of the PSP, and especially la compañera Vivian Rivera, has always reminded us of that, and also how lacking the PSP and other organizations were in relationship to organizing women and accepting leadership from women and developing women's leadership. And because we were seriously lacking. And I think the movement continues to seriously lack. And as you pointed out, the machismo and the violence against women in Puerto Rico is now even called a national emergency. Mm-hmm. Let's not even talk about it in the US. And maybe Vivian could talk some more about, the struggle within the party of women, not only in the PSP, but in all the organizations. The Young Lords, you started out by saying machismo must be revolutionary. That was in their program. And it wasn't even discussed in the PSP program in the beginning. So, it was lacking, babe. And Vivian has been in the leadership of that.
Exacto. And Vivian, we all know that this is not a PSP problem at all. It's like you said, Jose, it's in every political organization. It's just about in every organization also. Vivian, you have been alone most of the time. Alone as a woman, but also with the ideas that there has to be, spaces have to be opened. There need to be positions within this organization. Mm-hmm. Could you please speak?
Well, I wasn't alone. I wouldn't say I was alone. There were numerous women, both in the PSP here in the United States, which is what I know most. who were constantly bringing up this issue. And that's why we formed a commission on women to try to begin to promote that discussion. Because again, it's, how do we, it always goes back to how do we change hearts and minds, right? How do you change a culture that is a patriarchal culture? How do you change change the history of movements which diminishes the role that women play in those movements? And we go back here to, from the early nationalists to, all of those movements. It's the men that are recognized. It's not looking at all of those women who were part of those movements. And so, I think that actually, as you say, this was not a PSP issue. This was an issue, that went beyond us. But now we're seeing it's an international issue. Violence against women is an international crisis. We're seeing it all over the world. Look at what's happening in India. Look at what's happening in China. Look at what's happening all over the world. Even our most dear, allies are still not also reaching that point where we're seeing how women are rising into those prominent forms of leadership. So, it was a battle that we did not make that link, even though now we talk about intersectionality, and that's what feminists speak of now, how everything is connected. Why we're seeing that many of the movements that are rising now here in the United States, social movements, are led by women. In Puerto Rico, el verano 2019, what was that? That was women. That was women led. And it was not just women, okay? We're talking about now a group of women, who were transgender, who were lesbian. It was bringing up all of those issues. And so, I feel hopeful that anything that rises now, even in Puerto Rico, we're going to see more women leading. And I think that's going to be important. They're going to take different structures. We're not going to see a PSP again. We're not going to see that kind of structure formed again. We're going to see different structures. And that's what people are experimenting with now.
Following this thought, the transformation of the MPI to the PSP was not a honeymoon process. There was a discussion in Puerto Rico, some independence leaders se fueron y formaron la Liga Socialista, something else. What was the process in United States among everybody was happy about the creation of the PSP, or everybody, well, eso es comercializar el movimiento. That was a expression sometime used in Puerto Rico. Buscan dinero. You document that process in your book?
I wanted to point out that in the first book on this topic, the Puerto Rican movement, Vivian wrote one of the articles, Our Movement, One Woman's Story. And we tried to make sure that in the recent book, Revolution Around the Corner, that women's voices were heard and expressed. But, we still have to write more about the struggle within the struggle. Now to lo que dice Manuel, there was a big conflict in the old MPI before 1970, the MPI to the PSP. In the US, there was one conflict was, as you say in Puerto Rico, si el MPI debiera pasar a ser marxista-leninista. Y lo que no querían ser marxista-leninista se fueron del MPI en Nueva York y Estados Unidos, y algunos formaron un capítulo del Partido Independentista, including one of the major leaders of the MPI, José Antonio Irizarry, que en paz descanse, did not agree with that transition. The other big argument was what is going to be the role of the party, PSP, in the United States, because that became a big debate between the old MPI folks and now all of this new leadership that was joining the MPI PSP, Vivian, Andy, Alfredo Lopez, Digna Sanchez, myself later on, others. These were second generation and third generation in some cases, Puerto Ricans raised in the US who had been part of the struggle in the US. They were already political before they joined the PSP. So the big debate was what was going to be the role of the PSP in the United States. And when the PSP said, especially among the young and new leadership, that the PSP also had to work towards socialism, social change in the United States and organize Puerto Ricans around issues in the United States, there was disagreement, between different sectors, but it held together in the first document called Desde las Entrañas, which brought together all of those different, influences and different ideas, and also different people, because one thing you got to say about the PSP, it was multi-generational, English proficient, non-English proficient, Spanish proficient, old thing, multi-class. And hablando de Massachusetts, because you probably have a lot of audience in Massachusetts. Maybe Vivian will talk a little bit about, the organization of the PSP outside of New York City. But it played a big role in Massachusetts.
Vivian.
Yeah, there were definitely conflicts, and that's part of what we try to present in this new book, right? In Revolution Around the Corner, that how you balanced and made priorities towards what was a movement that supported independence for Puerto Rico, and at the same time wanted to see radical social change in the United States. No small goal, right? And so that tug, that push and pull was a constant. And that was basically, a fundamental part of the dynamic that played out when it was transitioning then from MPI to PSP. Those of us who wanted to see a stronger movement where Puerto Ricanos in the United States that supported and called for independence of Puerto Rico were also influencing change here, radical change here in the United States. So that then combined with the language issue. Okay. Yo sí hablo español. De hecho, mi primer lenguaje fue el español. En casa lo que hablábamos era español. Pero al uno crecer y formar entonces parte de toda una estructura donde lo que se habla es inglés, pues entonces eso domina. So yeah, that's why I switched back and forth, right?
Vivian, what are some of the top reasons that we saw the disintegration then of this movement or of the PCP? But like Jose said earlier, things change names even though they have the same goals.
Yeah.
So if you could please talk about that. And also the immense power that we Puerto Ricans have here. We get to vote for president. We have for members of Congress with an actual vote.
Right.
And at the same time, we're not so involved here And the votes we, when we vote, we influence what's happening in Puerto Rico. If only we would vote in larger numbers. But first question is, what were some of the reasons for the disintegration?
Well, a large part, I would say, was that there was a large, there was a huge debate that emanated from the elections in Puerto Rico, and the results of those elections, and how the party then, what was the support then that the party gained in electoral votes. That led to somewhat of a disillusionment, that the vote was a very weak one, and then there was the struggle between those who felt that partially getting into the electoral political arena diminished then the party building at the base level. And that's really what had to happen. That if we were going to make a revolution, we had to, do this from the ground up. We had to build, stronger bases, both within community and in the workplace. And so that was one part of the struggle. I would say that there was another part of those who felt that maybe actions had to be a bit more revolutionary in tone. So discussion around armed struggle. What did that mean? How did that influence where we needed to go? So all of those debates, which were large debates and long-standing debates in Puerto Rico, then influenced what happened in the United States. In the United States, we had seen that because we became so involved in major campaigns to mobilize Puerto Ricans and support among North Americans, right? We did these two huge events. Madison Square Garden, October 27, 1974, 20,000 people calling for independence for Puerto Rico. 2 years later, the bicentennial without colonies in July 4th, 1976, mobilizing over 60,000 people, Philadelphia and over in the West Coast. So now that then created another debilitating effect among the membership. You start doing those kinds of campaigns. What was the central point of those campaigns? One of them was independence for Puerto Rico. For the bicentennial, it included many other issues, around housing, employment, immigration, women, you name it, it was there. And so there was both a weakening, of the base in these mobilizations, but also in then not really focusing, and I think this happened both in Puerto Rico as it did in the United States, the focus on that long-term grinding, organizing effort. That takes time. We're even seeing it now. I just read this very good article by Stacey Abrams and the campaign manager, where she gives an organizing 101. What do you have to do to change people to vote a different way, to act a different way? It takes a long time. So she says, you need a 10-year plan. Well, we needed the 50-year plan. And it's hard to get people to get excited about things like that, because you want to see change happening quicker. And so it was a combination of those things, in addition to just our, we created a bureaucratic structure and a very top-down structure, which was not helpful. And we wanted to pronounce these huge kind of victories that made people then question, is this really going to happen now? Am I going to be able to, do this now? So that was part of it.
And then the second part of the question, for you, Vivian, y después José, los puertorriqueños no votan aquí, en los números que votamos en Puerto Rico. So therefore, we can have so much influence. There's 5 million of us here, not all voters, obviously, because there's a bunch of 5-year-olds also. Pero like, how do you regard we have this power accessible to us, and we're not influencing how the United States treats Puerto Rico. Vivian y después José, por favor.
Well, that's always an interesting question. If I look at it from the lens of the left and of even Puerto Ricans who are independentistas, and this again is my own, assessment, what I'm perceiving oftentimes. They don't always want to link themselves to the electoral process here in the United States. And they see that as perhaps somewhat contradictory to their ideologies. That I think is the more nationalist, if I want to put a spin on it, of what it is, a nationalist perspective. There's a mistrust too. There's an incredible mistrust in the system. And so, you have the extreme right calling about a rigged system, but you have ordinary people talking about a rigged system that doesn't represent them. So, I think that is one part of it, why people don't vote, because they don't see how the vote changes their situation. That's here in the United States, I think, for the most part. You have now, which again is an interesting process, and we'll see where this leads. The Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez phenomenon. Can a person of what she represents, her values and what she proposes, can that have a longer term effect in bringing up more young people to get involved in the political process? And we have to rely on the young people. It has to come from the younger ones who are voting, from the 18s on up, because ya yo tengo 72 años casi, I mean, I'm going to be around for a little while, I hope, but we gotta get those young people in there.
There has to also be a generational passing of the torch.
Exactly.
On this election issue, for the folks who read the new book, Revolution Around the Corner, you will see that the PSP missed out on a lot of opportunities in the electoral arena. Partly because of one of the things Vivian says, that there was, this divide over what the role of the PSP should be in elections in the United States, including supporting candidates who were running on the Democratic Party line. But the party played significant roles in the electoral arena. Chicago, the election of the first African-American mayor, Harold Washington. You'll read in the book that the PSP played a key role in the election of Harold Washington. Luis Gutierrez and Chuy Garcia in Chicago. In Boston, there was the election of Mel King, the campaign of Mel King. In New York City, José Rivera, who was elected, was a PSP member, and the PSP afterwards got him elected, didn't really give him the kind of support that he needed. We ran in support of candidate Frank Barbaro, New York City, who almost won the Democratic primary against Mayor Edward Koch. There were plenty of opportunities in the Bronx for the Puerto Rican Socialist Party to really be the key electoral force in the Bronx. But this debate about whether we should participate in elections, especially if you think the revolution is around the corner. That's where Vivian's title comes back. Y la revolución está a la vuelta de la esquina. ¿Qué vamos a estar hablando de apoyar Partido Demócrata, candidatos? Si la revolución viene ya. So that attitude. And one last thing, the people from New Jersey, they say that it's not that they left the PSP, is that the PSP left them. Como the Japanese in World War II, who were on some of those islands and the war had already ended, and they kept fighting because they didn't know the war had already ended. But the PSP was in the U.S. was autonomous, but it was still under the direction of the Central Committee in Puerto Rico. And so when the party decided to dissolve itself in 1993, todo eso, la seccional no tenía ninguna voz cantante en eso. Sí participó, pero I think from listening to the voices, the great majority of PSP members thought that was an error to dissolve the PSP. Pero eso era una decisión de Puerto Rico.
José, following that statement, dentro de los Estados Unidos había un issue de que Chicago o Nueva York controlara el movimiento pro independencia. Ejemplo, la gente de Boston, la gente de Hartford, de Filadelfia. Existía ese issue de que Chicago o New York City controlaran everything, fueran la cara del movimiento independentista.
Yeah, that was one of the conflicts. I think Vivian mentioned that in terms of internally. Yeah. And by the way, we took a lot of cadres from Massachusetts and we brought them to New York to head up the party superstructure that Vivian was talking about. And we weakened some of those organizations in Boston and in Springfield. And, you know, a lot of the leadership of the PSP in the US came from outside of New York City. Mm-hmm. Chicago felt that they had, since they were so far away, they could pretty much get away with anything because they weren't that close to New York. But all the other folks, New York, Philadelphia, Connecticut, were, you know, this conflict about New York-centered leadership was always a problem.
Yeah, yeah. That's an interesting question, even for organizations, you know, that exist, whether they're political or not. When you start branching out to other states, and the central leadership is in one place, there's always this una pugna, no? Like it's like, you know, you're not listening to us, you're not, you know, we're everything is coming from you and not from us. So that's what happened a lot in the PSP. But one thing we have to say is that during the period when at our height in the 70s, where were the majority of Puerto Ricans living? They were in New York. Mm-hmm. There were millions of Puerto Ricans in New York. And that's why the PSP grew so dramatically. Where first in New York? It went from El Barrio and then it went to all these other boroughs, to the Bronx, to Brooklyn, and it expanded through the neighborhoods. And then it started branching out to the tri-state, right? To New Jersey, to Connecticut, then Chicago. Chicago then, you know, went further into Gary, Indiana, and then in California. So it was a growth that happened very quickly. When you look at it from the 1970, 72, 73, which was when we then declared 73 that we were PSP, una seccional, U.S. branch. Mm-hmm. That growth happened very quickly, which was what allowed it to then do all those big mobilizations. And people came from all over the country, you know? Yeah.
Vivian in the book does a organigrama of the PSP. People don't understand that the PSP had, you know, what was it, Vivian, 40-something, chapters and, you know, hundreds and hundreds of members and sold thousands of Claridad and all of that. At one point at its height, it was a nationwide vast organization, which then developed a whole big superstructure to run it, which was, you know, hindsight and error. But, you know, this was the largest organization of the Puerto Rican left and the one that lasted the longest and whose influence is still felt throughout the country.